Hello, welcome to the history of ancient Greek philosophy. Over these next few weeks, we're going to be examining writings, thoughts, arguments, concepts, and the way of life of philosophers from Thales to the Hellenistic period. This period in the history of philosophy is one of the richest and most diverse that you'll find. And it's also essential for understanding later philosophical thought in the Western traditions, because it all begins here. Philosophical inquiry in the West starts with the Greeks. So let's get started.
And here come the Greeks, led out by their veteran centre-half, Heraclitus. Let's look at their team. As you'd expect, it's a much more defensive lineup. Plato's in goal, Socrates a front-runner there, and Aristotle as sweeper. Aristotle very much the man in form.
We'll begin at the beginning, as if we had any idea where things begin and where they end. Our beginning is Thales, the very first Greek philosopher. Thales lived from around 625 BCE to 546 BCE in Miletus, a community in Ionia, part of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. He was born there to Phoenician parents. There are many legends and stories about Thales. Historically accurate or not, we have no way of knowing. Thales is said to have traveled to and learned from the wisdom of the ancient Egyptians. He was occupied with astronomy and mathematics intensively. He is said to have predicted an eclipse during his lifetime. Plato tells the story of Thales falling into a well, so preoccupied was he with stargazing and examining the wonders of the heavens above. So I hope you're wondering why Thales is the first philosopher. Now, if someone were to ask you, how do you know Thales is the first philosopher? You might say, because I told you so. And I, in turn, might say that I know that Thales is the first philosopher because when I was an undergraduate and I took my first ancient Greek philosophy course, Professor Eady told me that Thales was the first philosopher, and I believed him. And maybe he would have a similar story to tell, and we might trace this back. Maybe we could trace it back all the way to the ancient Greeks. In fact, we can. If we look at Aristotle, Metaphysics Book Alpha, we find that Aristotle says that of the first philosophers, most thought the principles which were of the nature of matter were the only principles of all things. And a few lines later, talking about those first philosophers, he says the founder of this sort of philosophy was Thales. There we go. Thales, the founder of this type of philosophy. So we have it on Aristotle's authority that Thales is the first philosopher. Now, authority and tradition have their place, but we might not be satisfied with that. If we're not satisfied with that, we have to look closer at what Thales actually said. Now, if you remember what we were just reading in Aristotle, you might remember he said something about material principles, about nature. He was talking about the type of explanations that Thales was giving. And so to rank Thales as the first philosopher might have something to do with what he's trying to explain. Thales was certainly not the first person to think about nature and our place in the universe at large. We can find lots of speculations pertaining to how we fit in with the world we find ourselves in earlier writers in the Greek tradition as well. We can look to Homer, we can look to Hesiod. Think of one example. Homer, in Book 11 of the Iliad, there's a scene in which Zeus sits atop Mount Olympus, urns at either side of him, one containing good fates, one containing bad fates. When you are born into the world, one of two things happens to you. Either Zeus grasps into the barrel of bad fates and sprinkles those down upon your head, or, if you're really lucky, Zeus will take not something just from the good fates, but he'll take a little bit out of both. So you're fated from birth either to live a life that is totally crummy or only partly crummy. But what sort of explanation is Thales giving Aristotle said he talks about a material principle. Thales had no word for matter as far as we know. That's an idea that Aristotle introduced. And what we do know about what Thales said is precious little. It's not clear that we have any actual direct citations out of anything that Thales wrote. However, Aristotle does tell us one thing that Thales said, and other ancient authors do confirm this. In Aristotle's words, Thales said, arche panton hudor, the beginning or source, arche, of all things, panton, is hudor, water. Everything is water.